It was a small, forgotten town nestled between deep woods and miles of farmland, a place where nothing ever seemed to change. Except every year in late October, a pumpkin patch appeared, not a regular one either. It was an old patch with huge pumpkins that looked almost ancient, their orange skins stained with dirt, cracked in places like they'd grown there for centuries. But the town's residents, desperate for any Halloween tradition, flocked to it. No one knew who owned it. It simply appeared on the same day each year and vanished the day after Halloween. This year, a group of teenagers, bored with the predictable routines of the town, decided they'd make this Halloween unforgettable. There were four of them: Jared, Kyle, Emily, and Sarah, each with their own reason to seek a thrill. They'd grown up with stories about the patch, rumors that went far beyond its eerie appearance. Some said you could hear voices if you stood in the middle at night, whispering, calling. Others said the patch had been cursed for as long as the town existed, that the pumpkins weren't meant to be touched, not after dark. They brushed it off, of course, figuring they were just ghost stories. On Halloween night, they decided they'd sneak into the patch after it closed. No one had ever been there after dark. The moon was barely a sliver, casting weak light as they crept through the fence, their flashlights creating bouncing orbs in the pitch-black field. The pumpkins looked larger now, almost too large. The silence was unnerving, as though the patch itself was holding its breath. They reached the middle of the patch, surrounded by towering pumpkins that seemed to lean toward them, their jagged shapes oddly human in the shifting shadows. Jared, always the one to push the limits, dared them to smash one of the pumpkins to see what was inside. "It's just a vegetable," he said, laughing, before lifting the heavy flashlight above his head and bringing it down hard on the nearest pumpkin. The crack echoed across the field, but instead of seeds and pulp, a thick black ooze spilled out of the crack, its texture slimy and unnatural. A foul odor rose from it, something rancid and decaying, and the ground beneath the pumpkin seemed to writhe. Emily screamed, stepping back as the ooze spread, seeping into the dirt. They all watched, horrified, as something else began to emerge from the crack. At first, it looked like roots, thin, gnarled tendrils pushing their way out. But then the tendrils moved, twitching like fingers. More of them spilled out, reaching across the ground. Suddenly, the ground itself started to shift. The dirt under their feet softened, sinking as if something beneath it was rising. Kyle's voice trembled as he asked, "What the hell is this?" But no one had an answer. They could only watch in mounting terror as the dirt opened up around them, revealing dark, yawning holes that weren't there before. It was as if the patch itself was alive, waking up from some ancient slumber. Jared, frozen in disbelief, was the first to be grabbed. The tendrils shot out from the pumpkin, wrapping around his ankle with impossible strength. He screamed as it yanked him forward, pulling him toward the cracked pumpkin's opening. The others tried to grab him, but more tendrils erupted from the ground, lashing out like whips, wrapping around their legs and arms, pulling them into the soft, sinking soil. Sarah's flashlight hit the ground, casting one last shaky beam as she disappeared into the darkness beneath. Emily fought hardest, clawing at the dirt as the tendrils dragged her down, her fingers leaving deep trenches in the earth. But the ground swallowed her, just like the others, until there was nothing left but the stillness of the patch. When morning came, the pumpkin patch looked the same as always, untouched, as if the events of the previous night had never happened. The pumpkins sat in their rows, large and inviting, waiting for the next group of visitors. The town searched for the teenagers, but no one found a trace. The pumpkin patch, as it always did, vanished the day after Halloween, leaving behind nothing but rumors and whispers. But the story didn't end there. The following year, as Halloween approached, a new patch appeared. This one was different, though. There were 4 pumpkins in the middle, larger than any others, with familiar shapes. Their surfaces were smooth, but if you looked closely, you could almost see faces in the creases of their skin. Faces twisted in horror, mouths open in silent screams. The pumpkins were still there, waiting for someone else to make the mistake of touching them. The old motel had stood at the edge of town for as long as anyone could remember. It was the kind of place travelers passed by without a second glance, its faded sign flickering weakly in the night, its windows darkened with grime. But every town had its secrets, and this motel held one that the locals avoided talking about. Room 16 was never rented out. No one had stayed in it for years, not since the last guest who had disappeared without a trace. Ella, a young woman on her way to a new job in a distant city, didn't know about the motel's dark history. She was just looking for a place to spend the night after driving for hours, and when she spotted the vacancy sign through the rain-soaked windshield, she decided it would do. She parked, grabbed her bag, and hurried inside. The old man behind the counter barely looked at her as he slid a key across the desk. "Room 15, he muttered, but Ella hesitated. Through the dingy hallway, she saw the door to room 16. The brass numbers were dull, but something about it pulled at her. "What about room 16? She asked, her voice casual, but her curiosity piqued. The old man's hand froze on the key, his eyes, glassy and lifeless, fixed on hers. "That room is out of service," he said, his voice dropping into a low, almost fearful whisper. "It's better left alone." But Ella, feeling emboldened by the weariness of her long journey, felt a strange tug of rebellion. "I'll take that room," she insisted. The old man's mouth opened to protest, but after a long pause, he simply shrugged. "You won't want to stay," he said quietly, "but I won't stop you." He switched the key without another word and handed her the one marked with the number 16. The air felt colder as she walked down the hall. The closer she got to room 16, the more uneasy she felt, but she shook off the sensation, convincing herself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on her. When she opened the door, the room was as ordinary as any dingy motel room might be: old furniture, faded curtains, and a musty smell. But there was one thing that stood out. On the wall, directly across from the bed, hung a large oval mirror in a tarnished silver frame. It looked ancient, the kind of thing that didn't belong in a place like this. She set her bag down and stared at her reflection for a moment, brushing the rain from her hair. The mirror was old and speckled, distorting her reflection slightly, but there was something about it that she couldn't shake. Her reflection seemed wrong. She laughed at herself, shaking her head. "You're just tired," she muttered, pulling back the covers on the bed. But as the night wore on, Ella began to feel it. The unease in her chest grew heavier, like the room itself was pressing in on her. She tossed and turned, trying to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she felt watched. Her skin prickled, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She turned on her side, facing the mirror. At first, it was just her reflection staring back at her, but then she noticed something else. There was a shadow behind her. Her breath caught in her throat as she sat up and whipped around. Nothing, just the dark, empty room. She laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping dread, but when she looked back at the mirror, her blood turned to ice. The reflection hadn't changed. There was still a shadowy figure standing behind her in the mirror, a tall, gaunt shape, faceless but unmistakably there. Ella's breath came in short gasps as she slowly turned again, her heart pounding in her ears. The room was empty, but the figure remained in the mirror. She scrambled out of bed, her mind racing. Maybe it was a trick of the light, she told herself. Maybe the old mirror was warped, causing weird reflections. But no matter how she moved, the figure stayed, looming closer and closer with each passing second. It wasn't until she was pressed against the far wall, staring into the mirror in horror, that she realized the figure wasn't behind her. It was coming from inside the mirror. The reflection started to move on its own. Her reflection, her own self, slowly turned to face her, eyes wide and hollow. It smiled, a smile that didn't belong to her. The gaunt figure loomed closer, stepping out from behind her reflection, its shadow stretching out of the glass as though reaching into the room. Ella's legs felt like lead as she backed up, but the mirror started to ripple, the surface warping like water. The shadow figure reached through the glass, its long, bony fingers wrapping around the frame. It pulled itself halfway out, a grotesque, twisted form of something not quite human, its eyeless face turning toward her. Ella screamed and stumbled toward the door, her fingers fumbling with the lock as the thing crawled out of the mirror, its body cracking and contorting with each step. She managed to yank the door open just as the thing reached for her, and she bolted into the hallway, slamming the door behind her. She ran until she reached the front desk, her heart racing, her skin crawling with fear. The old man looked up from his seat, his expression tired and unsurprised. "I told you," he said, his voice calm but grim. "No one ever stays in room 16. The next morning, Ella left the motel as fast as she could, not daring to look back. As she drove away, she caught one last glimpse of the old place in her rearview mirror. For a moment, just for a heartbeat, she thought she saw someone, something, standing in the window of room 16, watching her leave. She never spoke of that night again, but the memory stayed with her, an ever-present weight. She could never look at another mirror the same way, because no matter where she was, no matter how much time passed, whenever she stood in front of a mirror, she could still see it. The shadow, waiting just beyond the glass, ready to return. The town of Black Hollow was bordered by a dense forest that everyone knew, but no one dared to enter after dark. The locals called it the Whispering Woods. Generations of stories had been passed down about the strange things that happened to those who ventured too far inside. Stories of lost hikers never seen again, of people hearing voices that called out to them from the shadows, and of things in the trees that watched with hungry eyes. But most people in town treated these stories as just that, legends designed to scare children. But not every child believed the warnings. Jake, a 16-year-old who had grown up on tales of the Whispering Woods, was determined to prove they were nothing but ghost stories. Halloween night seemed like the perfect opportunity to settle the debate once and for all. His friends, Derek, Olivia, and Claire, weren't as enthusiastic, but they were too curious to let him go alone. So, armed with flashlights and a video camera, the four of them headed into the woods just as the sun was setting. The air changed the moment they crossed the tree line. The breeze that had been cool and refreshing outside the forest now felt thick, heavy, like it carried something more than just the scent of the trees. The sounds of the outside world, the distant hum of traffic, the wind rustling the leaves, vanished, replaced by a silence so deep it pressed against their eardrums. Even the birds and insects seemed to avoid the woods. It was as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting. They walked deeper, their flashlights casting long shadows between the gnarled trunks. "See?" Jake said, forcing a laugh to hide his unease. "Just trees and dirt. Nothing to be scared of." But no one responded. They were all feeling it, the strange electric tension that seemed to hum through the air, making the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Olivia walked a little faster, sticking close to Claire, who kept looking over her shoulder like she expected to see something following them. About 20 minutes in, they came across something unexpected. A small clearing, with an ancient, crumbling stone well in the middle. Moss-covered and forgotten, it seemed out of place, like it belonged in another time. Jake moved toward it, curiosity overtaking caution. He leaned over the edge, shining his flashlight down into the darkness below. "Don't," Olivia said, her voice sharp, but Jake ignored her. He dropped a stone into the well, listening for it to hit the bottom, but no sound came. It was as if the well had no end. Derek, more on edge than the rest, shifted uncomfortably. "We should go. This place is giving me the creeps." But before anyone could respond, they heard it, a voice. Faint at first, like a distant whisper carried on the wind, but it grew louder, clearer. It was calling a name, Jake's name. "Jake," the voice breathed, soft and sweet like a lullaby carried on the breeze. "Come closer." His heart skipped a beat. He whipped around, shining his flashlight through the trees. There was nothing there, but the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Jake, come." He stepped back from the well, his pulse quickening. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking now. But Olivia and Claire were already pale, their eyes wide with fear. "I don't like this," Claire whispered. "We need to leave. Now." But Jake seemed frozen, his gaze locked on something just beyond the trees. His friends followed his line of sight and saw them. Figures barely visible in the dark, standing between the trees. They weren't moving, just watching. Their forms were wrong, twisted and elongated, like shadows that didn't quite belong to anything human. And then, as one, they began to whisper. The voices were soft at first, unintelligible, but they grew louder, overlapping until they filled the woods, echoing off the trees in a cacophony of voices, all whispering Jake's name. "Jake, come closer, Jake." He took a step forward, as though drawn by an invisible string. Olivia grabbed his arm, pulling him back, panic rising in her throat. "Don't listen to them," she shouted. "We have to go." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more desperate. "Jake, stay with us. Forever." Then the trees began to move. At first it was just the sound of branches creaking, but soon the whole forest seemed to be shifting. The figures in the shadows stepped closer, their faces still obscured, their voices growing shriller, more urgent. The ground beneath their feet felt wrong, soft, like it was sinking. Derek pointed his flashlight at one of the figures, and for a moment they all saw it, its face. Pale, hollow-eyed, its skin stretched too tightly over its skull. It had no lips, just a wide, gaping mouth that whispered in a rasping voice. Suddenly, the ground beneath the well split open with a deafening crack, and the earth began to sink around them. Something was crawling out, long, skeletal hands pushing their way up from the dirt, the same twisted, shadowy figures that had been watching from the trees. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were real. The group turned and ran, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they stumbled through the dark, dodging low branches and roots that seemed to reach out for them. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, and now there were other sounds. Scratching, rustling, like something was moving just out of sight, chasing them through the trees. Jake tripped, his ankle twisting as he hit the ground hard. Olivia and Derek skidded to a stop to help him up, but as they reached for him, the voices shifted. They were no longer calling for Jake. They were calling for all of them. "Stay with us, all of you, forever." Claire screamed as something cold and wet brushed against her arm. She looked down and saw the same skeletal hand from the well, its bony fingers curling around her wrist, pulling her toward the ground. The others grabbed her, pulling her free, but more hands were emerging now, reaching up from the earth like they were trying to drag them down into the very soil itself. They broke through the tree line, panting and gasping for air as they finally escaped the forest. The moment they crossed out of the woods, the voices stopped. The air was still again, the night quiet, but none of them felt safe. Jake, bruised and shaken, looked back at the woods. For a second, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge, watching them, its hollow eyes glinting in the moonlight, before it disappeared into the shadows. They never spoke of what happened that night, but the town continued to whisper about the woods, about the voices that called to those foolish enough to enter. And every now and then, when the wind blew just right, you could still hear them, the voices in the woods, calling for someone to come closer. But no one in Black Hollow ever did.